Okay, well,
Okay. All right. Well, I guess I'll begin by saying that I am originally from Dorchester. I haven't lived there for a long time, but I have maintained ties because I still have family there. And as I have said to someone recently, Dorchester is the kind of place that you can leave, but it doesn't leave you. So this project, at any rate, I am currently still teaching part-time at Assumption University. I do a lot of local history in Framingham, where I live now, and I also like to write. And I have many friends who are fellow history buffs, and that kind of keeps me going. Now, let me just tell you a little bit about this project, all right? The origin story, if you will. Started over lunch. Last summer, 3 friends from the Boston Women's Heritage Trail that I've been involved with for quite a while. Now I'm on the advisory, but I was on the board for many years. We went to lunch to Lucy's, corner of Galvin Boulevard and Granite Avenue, which we thought was an appropriate place for us to gather because Lucy Stone is the namesake, and she was one of the most illustrious women to live in Dorchester. And we were celebrating the completion of the Hyde Park Heritage Trail of the Boston Women's Heritage Trail. And that was thanks largely to the work of Catherine Dibble, a longtime member of the Boston Women's Heritage Trail and a family friend. And so we were celebrating Catherine's trail, and we were talking about the fact that here we were in Dorchester, and it was Lucy Stone's home for many years, and there was no real big, large-scale Dorchester Heritage Trail. And there was something that was done by some students, a 6 to 8 week project revolving around Upham's Corner with short write-ups, and that was kind of a start. But we decided that Dorchester really needed a bigger story because it's a big place, the biggest place in the city, right? And so Catherine and I decided that we would do something about the fact that we needed a trail. And then who better to get in touch with was Earl Taylor, who knows just about everything there is to know about Dorchester and the historical Dorchester Historical Society that Catherine and I are both members of. So we got in touch with Earl, and we got in touch with some other members of the Boston Women's Heritage Trail, and we decided to embark upon this cooperative project. So that's basically what we did. And we were a very cooperative group, I must say. So we met on Zoom every couple of weeks and gathered together various bits and pieces of our research. I should say that we got started through Earl's work because he gave us a master list of Dorchester women from all over the section of the city. And our biggest first decision was Dorchester is a big place, and most of the Boston Women's Heritage Trails are walking trails. There's no way you could walk all throughout Dorchester and see the places associated with so many women.
What is this? To talk about women's history in Dorchester.
Excuse me?
Can you put yourself on mute, please?
We decided to divide the section into 3 parts. And since there was already work done on Upham's Corner, we would start there. And we divided this first section into Upham's Corner, Jones Hill, and Savin Hill. So we had a master list from Earl. Catherine was a retired librarian, got us started on a lot of additional research. Earl provided lots of the pictures and illustrations. I did quite a bit of the writing, but we all did a little bit of everything. Now, the criteria that we used based on the Boston Women's Heritage Trail criteria were basically 2 main points. One is that the person had to have made a significant contribution to the community or to the larger society in many different areas. And secondly, they had to be deceased. So we know that there are many women out there who are still living, who are worthy of being on a trail, but we have to wait. So we got started in that way, and we moved on to the mapping and the write-ups. So here we are. Now I'm going to start my screen share, if that's okay.
Sure.
And all right, so okay. Oh yes, I see in the chat. Let me just say that if you I hope to leave some time for questions. I'm planning on it. And if you have questions that you would like to put into the chat format, I can address them at the end, or you can feel free to ask them at that point as well. All right, now I'm going to start the slideshow. All right, can everyone see? We all set?
Yes.
Okay, so let me begin by saying, with respect to what you see here, there are 9 women whose portraits are, this is sort of a selected list, but I am going to be talking about several more, but we chose these because they represented different periods of history and many of the different fields that Dorchester women and all women really have been involved in. All right, I'm going to begin with just a little bit of historical background that just to remind everyone that Dorchester roots go way back to the beginning of the history of this country. So the recorded history dates to 1630, which was the sort of official year of the founding of the city of Boston. The first Puritans from Dorset, England, arrived on the Mary and John. And what they found was a lot of water, the ocean, of course, and the Neponset River that was provided fishing and other ways of living for the indigenous people of the area. Now, this water gave rise to, once the Dorchester, of course, as all of what eventually became the 13 colonies in the United States, started out as an agricultural place. And then industry began to develop around the water. So we had the building of mills, the famous chocolate mill, we had iron mills and the milling of grain. Some of these mills, by the way, were tidal mills, like the one that the street that I grew up on, Mill Street, was named for. In addition, we had, of course, with more people moving into the area, there were roads. We had Dudley Street, what became fondly known as Dot Avenue, and Columbia Road. We had railroads first. We had the Old Colony Railroad that served the eastern part of this community that was developing, and the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, which was in the west. Old Colony gave rise to the Red Line, the T, and the Fairmount Line developed along the New York, New Haven, and Hartford in the western section. We also had streetcars as, again, the area became more developed, and these particularly were important to, they grew up along Blue Hill Avenue. And the picture that you see here in the bottom right-hand corner is of the streetcar in Upham's Corner. Now, while all of this history was taking place, oh, I should add that Dorchester was its own standalone community until the 1800s, when it was added piecemeal to the city of Boston, and the final annexation took place in 1870. Boston needed a place for the population to move and also needed a place for other public works. And so Dorchester provided that. Now, while all of this history was taking place, history was being written, although not as many books dedicated to the history of Dorchester as I expected to find when I first got started on this project. And if you look through those history books, you're going to find, if you go to the index, a lot of names, but you're not going to find many women. They were there, but their names are not. And for many of the same reasons why women just have not historically until recent times made it into those books. Sometimes it was bias, conscious or unconscious. It was also because the kinds of contributions that women made were not necessarily the kinds of contributions that get written up in history books. Like they weren't presidents and they weren't governors, they weren't generals and so forth, but they were doing a lot of good things that were important to development. Now let's take a quick look at the map. So I'm going to take you on a tour, our Upham's Corner, Jones Hill, Savin Hill tour. And we are going to sort of envision that we're walking at least parts of this. We couldn't walk all of it. And we're going to start in the Upham's Corner area with a cluster of homes around Dudley Street. And then we will move on over to the further east and then south and then north again, and then way over to Savin Hill, which nobody in their right minds would try to walk to. But at any rate, that's what this looks like, right? Okay, so I wish we could share the map with you at the same time that I'm talking, but at least you see it here. And there are a couple of corrections. One is Elizabeth Power. I believe there's no S in her name. And one of my favorites, Mrs. Fowle, is Alida, not Eliza. All right, so let's move on now to our first stop. Here we have Site 1, the corner of Dudley and Howard Streets. And this was the home of a woman with the great Yankee name of Hepzibah Clark Swan, who lived between 1756 and 1825. Now, she was a wealthy heiress, and if you look her up online or in some of those history books, you will find her described as a wealthy heiress and a patron of the arts, which indeed she was. But let's look at the time period. Oh, and I probably should just say at the beginning that Hepzibah didn't have the easiest personal life. She married a land speculator, James Swan, who kind of got into the habit of spending his wife's money pretty freely. And he ended up in France negotiating land deals and was sent to debtor's prison, where he eventually died. But during those years that he was imprisoned, Hepzibah did take care of him financially. Now, back to the time period. So she was born, we think, in 1756, but it hasn't been confirmed. And she lived until 1825. So much of her adult life was spent in the city where a lot of history was taking place. We have the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre. We have Paul Revere and his ride. And we have, of course, the Revolution and the Constitution and the War of 1812 and so forth. And while all of this history was being played out, there was a conscious effort to establish a national identity. And part of that national identity had to do with developing the arts. And this was really Hepzibah's great contribution. So if you look at the handsome home here, this was designed by Charles Bulfinch, whose career Hepzibah Swan promoted. And if you look at the floor plan, you can see some indications as to how well-to-do people lived in Boston and elsewhere at that time. We have a drawing room, we have a library, we have, a pantry and rooms for the servants. And so forth. And we have a sweeping portico area, rounded with steps leading up to it and so forth. So this home was designed by Charles Bulfinch, and the portrait that you see here of Mrs. Swan was done by Gilbert Stuart, whose career in art she promoted. She collected fine furniture, largely from France. Maybe your husband helped her out with that. And that is on display, or it's housed in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. By the way, I should mention that Hepzibah Swan entertained quite lavishly, and one of her most famous guests was the Marquis de Lafayette, who stopped there on his famous trip through the colonies to gather information about the prison system. Along with her friend Sarah Morton, she helped to found the Sans Souci Club, which was an exclusive social group of men and women who engaged in such scandalous activities as dancing and card playing, which were frowned upon by proper Bostonians. Now, another lasting contribution that we can't forget in talking about this remarkable woman was the fact that she wanted to help develop a fashionable neighborhood in proper Boston, and that was the Beacon Hill area. And so she was a member of the Mount Vernon proprietors who sought to upgrade the Beacon Hill section. And she built a row house there for herself and also homes for her 3 daughters. So I could go on, but we have to say goodbye to Hepzibah and move to our next stop, which is her friend, Sarah Wentworth Apthorpe Morton, who lived during the same period, but later. And we're also on Dudley Street here. And I should also say that if Hepzibah Swan had a difficult personal life, it really can't compare to Sarah's, because Sarah really had a very tumultuous marriage. I'll start with the scandal first, and then we'll move back to her contributions to get that scandal out of the way. She was born into a wealthy Boston family and well-educated. She married a Boston lawyer named Perez Morton, who, so at one point, the Mortons invited her younger sister, Fanny, to come and live with them. And Perez and Fanny had an affair. Fanny gave rise to a child as a result of the affair. And when the scandal was made, or became a public scandal, she committed suicide. Perez was challenged to a duel by Sarah's brother, but the sheriff stepped in and stopped that from happening because it was against the law, and also would add more to the scandal. So, and also, Sarah did have affairs, at least one affair that we know of, probably more, but she had one well-known affair with Gouverneur Morris from New York, who was one of the founding fathers and one of the signers of the Constitution. All right, but Sarah had talents that she developed on her own, and she left a mark, although by the time she passed away, some of her literary contributions were forgotten. But Sarah wrote a book, Awabi, and the Virtues of Nature. And this book, among others, this wasn't her only book, but this book was groundbreaking in that it was the first one with protagonist, with someone who, I'm hearing, and make sure everyone's audios are turned off. So the protagonist here was a Native American, an indigenous person, and this was a first.
Think it over, who knows, I mean, time will pass and.
Please put your phone on mute.
Turn your audios off, please, so that we can't hear you. Okay. All right. So she published under the pen name Colonial, and she
Mary Smoyer. Please put yourself on mute.
Right, you know,
Right.
but I don't think there's
Mary.
any.
Okay, I am muted. All right. So, where was I? All right, so that was the considered to be the first novel with an Indigenous person as a protagonist. And she also wrote about really serious topics, gender relations among people of different races and so forth. The book that's mentioned here on the screen was written, a book called The Power of Sympathy, which was written by her uncle and William Hill Brown. And this probably, I doubt that she was happy about it, but it was based on the family scandal involving her husband. Now, her home that you can see here is no longer standing, but it is the site of the Ray and Joan Kroc Community Center, also with an affiliation to the Salvation Army. All right, we're going to move on now to the third site in the same neighborhood. And, okay, let's see why I'm not, my screen is not moving here.
Anita, can you see the participant list? I can't admit people. Can you admit them?
Okay, I have 4 people entering the waiting room.
All right, can you click on the,
Okay, I'll admit them.
yeah, thank you.
Okay. And now can I, I'm not able to move to the next slide. I don't know why. You are? Did you do something on your end?
No, I
Uh,
think maybe you should try to stop sharing and then start again.
Okay, so now that we have all of these folks, all right, I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, and then I'm going to try to screen share again. Is that what I should do?
Yes, yes.
Share screen. Okay. Slideshow. Share. Okay. That worked. All right, so we're up to site 3. We're still on Dudley Street. And we don't have any image of Lucy Ann Kirk. The image that you see here is of her headstone, which is in the Dorchester North Burying Ground. Lucy Ann was a woman who made her own way as a homeopathic physician. She was born in Dorchester, and she decided at a pretty early age that she wanted to be a nurse. And so she attended public schools in the community, and she went to Hartford, Connecticut, where she trained as a nurse. And she worked for several years in that capacity before she enrolled at Boston University School of Medicine and earned a Doctor of Medicine, which was quite an achievement for someone of her time. This was in 1893. And she did some postgraduate work in New York, where and came home after that and established a medical practice. I should say, by the way, kind of a fun fact about her time at Boston University. She, apparently the class that she was in was the first class to wear caps and gowns. And so she authored the class poem, Caps and Gowns, and advocated originally for those to be worn. So she was a member of several medical associations and on the staff of a hospital called Boothby, which was in Boston. And she was also on the staff of the homeopathic medical dispensary. And in her spare time, she gave lectures to nurses and talks to mothers on matters of hygiene. Still on, well, we're moving from Columbia Road, sort of across the way now. And we are looking at information about one of my favorites, and that would be Alida Rumsey Fowle, who lived from 1842 to 1919. So the first 2 women that I talked about were from the Revolutionary period. Alida is from the Civil War period, and the Civil War figured prominently in her life and her accomplishments. So Alida was moved to Washington. She was born, well, one source says New York, another says Chicago. But anyway, she wasn't born here. She went to Washington, D.C. with her family when she was a young woman. And the Civil War was just in its early stages, and she wanted to make a contribution to the war effort. So she did the usual, working in hospital, tending to the wounded. She also helped to make crutches and canes. And she had a beautiful singing voice. And so a special contribution that she made was to give concerts and to sing to wounded soldiers and also to prisoners of war. Now, she sang at religious services that were held on the floor of the United States House of Representatives, where she married a Bostonian, John Allen Fowle, and they were perhaps the first to be married on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. He was working as a clerk in the Navy Department at that time. Now, in addition to singing and working in the hospitals and so forth, Alita felt that the minds of the men who were wounded in war shouldn't be neglected. And so she used her own earnings from her singing to establish a library, a free library for recovering soldiers that was established near the U.S. Capitol on land that was granted for the endeavor by the United States Congress. If you walk in almost any neighborhood now, you see these little free libraries everywhere. And while there's, I'm sure, no direct connection, but when I see them, I think of Alita, because the free library was her contribution to the Civil War effort. And also, after the war was over, when she and her husband moved to Dorchester and raised their family, she continued with her charitable work, and she opened a free library for local children in Dorchester. A short film about Alita called The Songbird of the North was based on her Civil War work. There is a link to it, but mostly that link involves listening to a college professor talk about the film and not the film itself. All right, moving along with on our trek here, we're going to stay kind of in the same neighborhood, Site 5. And here we have another woman who was involved in the medical field. And this is Hannah Glidden Merrick. Now, Hannah was a Dorchester native who decided at a very young age that she wanted to be a doctor. And she was a very strong student. Her father recognized this and felt that the best public school for her to go to was Boston Latin School, which didn't admit women. It was a boys' school. And he was determined that she should get in. So he paid for her to have private tutoring in Greek and Latin, which were prerequisites. And she eventually was admitted to Boston Latin School, which was a rarity. Earl told me the other day that she was probably the only woman to be admitted when it was strictly boys' school. So she went on to attend Smith College and received a BA in degree from not only from Smith, but then she went on to Johns Hopkins, where she earned her medical degree. She became the superintendent for the New England Hospital for Women and Children. She did that for about a decade, but then she went on to develop a specialty in what was known as industrial medicine. And industrial medicine was a field that tried to prevent accidents from taking place in factories, and also for caring for workers who might be injured on the job. And she became for 25 years, the physician for Schrath's Candy Company in Charlestown. Probably remember those boxes of chocolates with the with the fancy covers there. I guess they closed in the 1990s, but anyway, that's where she worked. She was also an amateur photographer, and she developed X-ray films, a technique for X-ray film that was used in the medical field. When she retired, she continued with her interest in photography, and she also was an avid gardener. And she helped to open a free dispensary in the Fields Corner section of Dorchester, which is going to be the one of the sites, one of the neighborhoods covered in our second trail. And she was so successful. She lived a long time. And in the last year of her very long life, she received a commendation from then Lieutenant Governor Donald Dwight, who gave her a commendation for her life of service. All right, now we're moving on Columbia Road to the Dorchester North Burying Ground to talk about two women. I hesitate to even say women because one of the people who was buried here was a child who was barely 2 years old named Anne. This site is important for many reasons, but this particular plot is significant because it is a testament about and evidence of slavery in the community and really throughout the northern colonies. This is a plot of land that was owned by a man named Colonel Robert Oliver, lived in Dorchester. He was a merchant who had connections to the island of Antigua. And as part of his household, there were 4 enslaved individuals whose headstones you see here. Anne is of great interest to me, and I wish I knew more about her. She only lived for a very short time, but you see an inset here on the slide, and that is a headstone from the common burying grounds in Newport, Rhode Island, which Colonel Oliver also had connections to. And it's an exact replica of the one in Dorchester. And so one does wonder what the backstory is. Why are there 2 headstones? And which came first? I'm assuming the one in Dorchester came first. I guess we'd like to think so. So there's a lot of history here. We also have the headstone of Betty, who is described in the headstone as a Negro servant of Colonel Robert Oliver, who died as a young woman as well. Francine Trester, local composer, musician, was commissioned to write a testament in celebration of the passage of the suffrage amendment about women on the Boston Women's Heritage Trail. It was called A Walk in Her Shoes. It was supposed to debut in 2020, but it was delayed 1 year because of COVID. And the 2 women whose headstones are in the Dorchester North Burying Ground, Anne and Betty, are celebrated in that musical composition. Now, moving on, again, Columbia Road, we have here another very interesting self-made woman, Sarah Baker. Sarah was an entrepreneur. She operated a bandbox business in Savin Hill. A bandbox is a round, I meant to get a picture of it. I'm sorry, I don't have one, but you've probably seen them. They're round boxes that held women's clothing, hats, and so forth, and often decorated with flowery decorations and so forth. So she was also a very devout woman, and she attended services at a church that was not in her own neighborhood. And she decided that she would use her earnings, her savings, to have a church built in the neighborhood that she lived in. It wasn't going to be helpful to her because the way she structured this whole project was that she would invest $5,000 of her savings, and 20 years after, and it would be saved for 20 years and earn interest. And at the end of that time, it would be used to build a church. Now, I checked on the equivalency for today, and $5,000 at the time that Sarah Baker lived would be, in buying power at least, the equivalent of $197,000 today. So that was a significant amount of money. And she, it wasn't quite enough though to build the grand church that you see here. But the proceeds from the sale of another church, the Mount Pleasant Methodist Episcopal Church, which was disbanded, the proceeds of that sale was put together with Sarah's money, and it was used to build the Baker Memorial Church, which was on the corner of Columbia Road and Cushing Avenue. Unfortunately, it closed in 1943 and the building was demolished. All right, moving on to site 8. I think we better walk a little faster here if we want to finish in an hour. But anyway, we have 543 Columbia Road, and we have the home of Julia Knowlton Dyer. That's what you see in the right-hand corner. And we have the picture of the institution that she was associated with in the bottom corner. So Julia lived from 1829 to 1907. She was born in New Hampshire. She was educated there, and she taught high school in Manchester until she married a man named Micah Dyer Jr., who was an attorney in Boston. And they bought a house on Columbia Road, the one you see here. And once her children were old enough to be left or to be more or less on their own, she really let loose and became involved in a number of charitable causes, including her proudest achievement, which was her role in establishing a place that was called the Women's Charity Club Hospital in Roxbury, which did basically what the title tells you that it did. She also raised money for the Chelsea Soldiers Home. She was on the board of directors of the Dedham House for Discharged Female Prisoners. So we can only imagine what kinds of aid they gave to women who were released from prison. And she also was a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which I'll talk a little bit more about soon. So Julia was so active in all of these causes that when she passed away, the Globe obituary noted that she was, quote, one of the best known club and society women in Boston. Uh-oh. I admitted somebody and now I'm having trouble screen sharing. Okay, here we go. Oops. All right. Now, a more contemporary woman at Site 9 is the brilliant student, Frances Sofrino Kissel. So Frances was born in 1922. I say she was a brilliant student because she attended both Radcliffe College, from which she graduated, and Boston College School of Law. And she graduated from both of those schools #1 in her class. Now, Frances, she carved out a career for herself in law. A lot of firsts are associated with her. She was the first woman appointed to the U.S. Attorney General's office. She was the U.S. Attorney for the District of Massachusetts. She was a litigation attorney for the U.S. Small Business Administration. She was also politically very active. She was the co-chairman of John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign in 1960. She was married to a man named Adolph Butch Kissel, who was a scout for the Buffalo Bills. She enjoyed sports, and she helped him in his scouting activities. So she led a very full life. Unfortunately, and she was included in 1958 in Who's Who in American Women. But she left town at one point and moved all the way to Wareham, where she, a lifelong learner that she was, she earned a master's degree in education from what is now Bridgewater State University. And while she was living in Wareham, she was involved with the Otis Advisory Council, the American Legion, and as an environmentalist, the Coalition to Save Buzzards Bay. Moving to Site 10, Payson Avenue, we have two artists. Charlotte Johnston and Sarah Jane Frances Johnston. And they were part of a family of artists. Of the two, I would say the more eclectic was Charlotte. She worked, she did pictures in crayon and watercolors, but she was also a concert pianist. She was an actress. She belonged to a theater company that was called the Boston Museum Company. And she was an elocutionist who gave speeches. Now, her sister, Sarah Jane, studied with the brilliant and tragic William Morris Hunt. She was noted for her charcoal portraits. And one of her great achievements that no longer, I don't know, maybe it exists somewhere, but the building itself that she created the stained glass window for, the Barnard Memorial Chapel, is no longer standing. Now, this was an interesting church in that it was located on Warrenton Street in Boston, and it was a chapel for children, and whose parents and caregivers did not need to pay for them to participate in activities there and to attend services. So that's a picture that you see of a building that no longer exists. The two pictures at the bottom are examples of her drawing. All of the many of her drawings, and also those of other members of her family, including her parents, are stored in the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester. All right, walking south along Hancock Street, we come to Charles Street, and we have Site 11, Mary Hannah Hanchett Hunt. Mary's claim to fame was her affiliation with the women's Christian temperance movement. Now, Mary was a teacher, and she specialized in science, and she used her training as a science teacher to show how the destructive effects of alcohol on the body. And she specialized in working with young children. After she married Leanda Hunt in 1852, she moved to Hyde Park, which is where she really got started in earnest with her temperance work. She developed a curriculum that she petitioned to have adopted by the Boston schools, and she was successful in that. It was a hygiene and health curriculum, and again, spread the word about the destructive effects of alcohol. And she started traveling throughout the country, lecturing for the temperance cause. She became named the educational chairman of the National Women's Christian Temperance Union. And she continued with her speech making and traveling, and became so well known that she was named the education director for the World Women's Christian Temperance Union. She moved to Charles Street in Dorchester from Hyde Park in 1893, where she lived until her death in 1906. She also wrote prolifically, particularly works for young children, including a book called Health for Little Folks and another called Lessons in Hygiene. Next, we have Site 12, which was on Quincy Street. We do not have a picture of Elizabeth Power, even though she lived until 1924. And she was the founder of an institution that was called the Free Home for Consumptives on land that is now a cul-de-sac on Fernald Terrace, which I would love to see because supposedly there's an environmental site there, sort of untouched oasis in the middle of the city. But at any rate, when the Free Home for Consumptives was there, and you can see two pictures of what it looked like, it provided care for people who were recovering from tuberculosis free of charge, regardless of their means, their race, their religion, their gender. And so this was a very worthy charitable cause, and she was the longtime president of the board. She also was appointed a trustee of the City of Boston Consumptive Hospital, but she decided to give that up largely because her heart was really with the Free Home for Consumptives, and she didn't feel that she could give justice to both institutions So she chose the one that was closest to her heart. She was recognized for her work with poor people who were suffering from tuberculosis, a terrible disease, with a papal blessing from Pope Pius X. Next, we have another more contemporary woman who lived on Jerome Street. And for Jerome Street, we would have to move up into the Jones Hill area. And this is Ethel Lennox. Now, Ethel originally lived in the West End, and she and some other women there were concerned about poor and working class women who lived near some of the great hospitals of Boston, but didn't really get the attention that they thought they deserved. And so when she moved to the Dorchester area, Ethel decided to do something about that. And she was a great fundraiser, and she solicited startup funds and found an office building to turn into a health center in the neighborhood, which was a new concept. It was dedicated to providing good health for poor people who lived in the community. And in her obituary, she was described as contributing the development of this concept, not only in the city of Boston, but throughout the country. And the Boston Globe obituary or one of the columns about her described her as ever feisty and sharp-tongued. So we can only imagine how she used her feistiness to raise money for what she believed in. And one of the Upham's Corner Health Center buildings is named the Ethel W. Lennox Healthcare Center in her honor. Okay, now site 14, we're getting there, folks. This is on Cushing Avenue. This is a hard one for me to describe in any kind of sensible chronology, because this is a site that had several different institutions over time. But the common thread is that, originally operated by the Daughters of Charity, a Catholic group, and they catered to the needs of women. Now, this probably the most well-known, at least when I was growing up in Dorchester, St. Margaret's Hospital was very well known, and it specialized in maternity and gynecological care. Eventually, St. Margaret's moved to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. I think that was in the 1990s. And the now it's the original St. Mary's Infant Asylum is now the St. Mary's Center for Women and Children. You see the picture in the corner. And I have to just put a personal note in here, because I was telling a distant cousin, distant in many ways, but now she's living in Arizona, that St. Mary's Infant Asylum was going to be, was on our trail, and that I was going to be talking about it. And she wrote a note back to me this morning in which she said, "Thank you for letting a place that provided help to women like my Gram when she was going through a tough time. Thanks for including that on the trail." Yeah, it was very touching to me. All right, chapter 15, site 15, we have another one of my favorites, and that is Geraldine Kendall Trotter. When I was learning history back in school, I heard of her husband, William Monroe Trotter, the school named after him. And she is described in many ways, but basically she was a civil rights activist. And she was the associate editor of an important civil rights newspaper, the Boston Guardian, which was co-founded by her husband, William Monroe Trotter, and a well-to-do philanthropist in Boston, G.W. Forbes. She was trained, I believe she went to the Everett Public Schools, but anyway, she attended a local business college, so she was trained as an accountant. And she used her accounting skills as well as her literary skills to in the business of running the newspaper. And she was instrumental in keeping it afloat. Now, this newspaper was seen as pretty avant-garde for its time because it talked about race relations not just as a Southern problem, that this was a problem throughout the country, the North as well as the South, and it sort of challenged white progressives in the North to take this issue more seriously and not just regard it as a problem that belonged to somebody else. She was a very well-rounded person. She had many interests. She was a member of the Equal Rights League, the Boston Literary and Historical Association, the Women's Anti-Lynching Society. She was a dedicated member of St. Mary's Episcopal Church, and she is also celebrated in Francine Trester's A Walk in Her Shoes. She died so young. She was only in her 40s in 1918 during the Great Influenza. Site 16, we have on Sawyer Avenue, the home of Isabel Hayes Chapin Burroughs. Now, she's another really amazing woman. She was born in Vermont, and she married a man named William Chapin. They were very dedicated to their religion, and they went to India as a young couple to work as missionaries. They were there just a couple of months when William died and left Isabel, a 19-year-old widow, in India. She didn't come right home. She stayed there for a while and taught school to young girls. She came back to the States, and she lived in Washington, D.C., where she married second husband, Samuel Barrows. Samuel Barrows worked in the State Department as a secretary to the Secretary of State at that time, William Seward. You've probably heard his name in conjunction with the purchase of Alaska, which was erroneously dubbed William Seward's Folly. So at one point, her husband became so ill that he couldn't carry out his duties in the State Department. So she filled in for him as a stenographer. And I guess we would call her an administrative assistant today. And she was the first woman to hold that role in the State Department. Now, after she worked there, she decided it was time to switch to another career, one that apparently she had been interested in for a long while, and that was to become a doctor. So she enrolled at a school called Women's Medical College in New York, and she earned her degree in medicine. She then traveled to Vienna to study more for her specialty, which was ophthalmology. Where better to go than Vienna for that? And she, when she returned to Washington, she opened a private medical practice in ophthalmology, the first woman to do so. She and her husband continued working for prison reform and other charitable causes, and they settled in Dorchester. Samuel decided he wanted a new career too, and so he enrolled in Harvard Divinity School and became a minister, and he was appointed the pastor of the Unitarian Church at Meeting House Hill in Dorchester. Isabel was also a member of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She testified before Congress in support of the 19th Amendment, along with Anna Howard Shaw, who was the president of the organization at that time. After Samuel died in 1909, she continued her work in reform movements until her death in 1913. Site 17, another favorite, Anna Clapp Harris Smith. She has a famous name. She's a descendant of one of the original families who settled in Dorchester, the Clapp family. As a child and all throughout her life, she was an animal lover, and her heart strings were tugged at when she saw stray animals in the streets, and she was particularly moved by the plight of the workhorses, who often looked mangy and uncared for as they trot around the city doing their work. So she decided to use her wealth to do something about that, and she established the Animal Rescue League of Boston in 1899. Under her leadership, improvements like installing water basins around the city where dogs and cats could drink water so they wouldn't be thirsty, and the founding of a Horses Aid Association to provide free healthcare for the city's work horses. They were part of her work. She also, her husband, Huntington Smith, was a newspaper publisher, and she's listed in the census of 1900 as a journalist. So apparently she liked to write. And she was also celebrated in Chester's A Walk in Her Shoes. And finally, we're going all the way over to Savin Hill near the water, 71 Grampian Way. And we're going to talk about a woman who made her mark far away from Dorchester, and that was Elizabeth Stanton Chadbourne. Now, Elizabeth lived in Dorchester with her family. Her father was a Boston police officer. And like many of us, he really didn't appreciate the winters in Boston. And so he liked to spend some of his winters, especially in his retirement, in Virginia. So he spent 4 winters there, and she went down to Virginia to apparently keep him company. Maybe she liked the warmer weather too. And she, by the way, her occupation, she was listed separately in the city directory under her own name with her own occupations, and they were a teacher of elocution and a public reader. Apparently public readers read from novels and entertained in that way. Anyway, down in Virginia, her father lived in a community called Parksley, and this was a community that was just getting started. And Elizabeth became involved in a group called the Parksley Land and Improvement Company. And she worked as the secretary and treasurer for that group and played a significant role in overseeing the development of the community. And in 1917, she decided that she would, it was time to move on. And so she sold her shares in the company, but she had left such a mark that Parksley, Virginia named a street after her. So if you go down to Parksley, Virginia, you will find a street that is called Chadbourne Street. Back in her retirement, she was active in the Dorchester Women's Club and in the Savin Hill chapter of the Red Cross. Okay, so that's the story. But since we started late, I think we still have a few minutes for some questions. But before we do that, let me just say that, to use a cliche, this is just the tip of the iceberg. You know, there are, I'm sure, dozens, hundreds more women. Perhaps you know some of them. Dorchester residents who left a mark and who belong on our trail. And if you do, contact Earl, send the names to him, and we'll see what we can do. This project was developed by the Boston Women's Heritage Trail, bwht.org, and the Dorchester Historical Society. If you go to the Boston Women's Heritage Trail site, you will see the origin story there. You might wish to contribute to support an organization that has done so much, started out as a school project, and now it's a really well-recognized historical association for the city of Boston. I should mention again that this was a collaboration between me and Catherine Dibble of the Boston Women's Heritage Trail, working with Earl Taylor. And I also should mention some help that we got towards the end from Mary Smoyer, who was one of the founders of the Boston Women's Heritage Trail and who reviewed our narrative and gave us lots of tips and helped us out with that. All right, so I'm going to stop screen sharing now. And let's see if I can find my chats. I know there were some questions. There were at least 3. Earl, can you, 4 maybe, let's see. Can you find our questions?
I'm looking. Chat.
Or maybe they were just,
I don't know why I can't get in. Let's see.
oh, well, we could just ask.
Sure, if you want to ask a question, you'll have to unmute.
Okay. Does anyone have a question that he or she would like to ask at this point?
Actually, I do.
Okay, go ahead.
No surprise. Could you say again what the other two trails are that you're going to be working on or are working on now?
Right. Okay. So the next one is going to be Meeting House Hill, Fields Corner to Clam Point, which I'm really interested in. Even more, well, I couldn't say even more so than this one, but that's where I grew up. So we're doing, that's the next one. And then the third one is going to be Neponset, Lower Mills, and Grove Hall. So those are, and that will also include Podman Square as well. So I think we will have covered everything, every section of Dorchester. And I should say at this point that we are hoping for more diversity among our celebrated women. And we think that that will happen with those sections of the trail.
Mm-hmm. So this sounds like, I mean, I'm just thinking about, you know, we have one, Earl knows, we have one person in our immediate neighborhood who is well-known, Shansonetta Stanley Emmons, who is a photographer. So I'm assuming that she would get picked up as part of Codman Square, hopefully.
Yes,
Yeah, I saw her on the list, didn't I, Earl? She's
You
on
did.
the list.
yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and you know, there may be others that we haven't uncovered yet. But okay, that's good. It sounds, what's the schedule? Have you got one?
Well,
When it's done, it's done.
well, we actually have done a lot of the research because we started with the master list, and so Catherine and I and others, and Earl got together. We did some basic research for all of them, and then we decided to group them in the way that we did. So it shouldn't take us as long to do the next two trails. So we're hoping, Earl, do we have a timeline?
Well, we're hoping by summer.
Right. So yeah, that would be nice. That's our goal. Okay. Okay. Is there a handout for this program? We don't have a handout, but there is going to be we can maybe think about that. Maybe when we get all three trails finished, we can work on a handout. But meanwhile, this has been taped, and so it will eventually be on the Dorchester Historical Society YouTube site. So you can get it there.
Isn't it also on the website? A lot of information.
The actual slideshow without an audio, just the pictures and so forth. I think we can do that.
Well, but there's also just the information about each person that's on the website. I assume.
Well, you can go to the Boston Women's Heritage Trail. If you go to their site, you'll see New Trail Dorchester, and it will have a lot of the information that I've just told you, probably more because I couldn't say everything, is there. So between that and you know, eventually, and the YouTube channel, you should be able to find a lot of additional information. Marty, I see your hand up.
Thank you. And this was very interesting, Anita. Some of these women have come up in house history research that we've done. But I did some of those reports and I learned some things that I didn't know. Do you know who the Barnard Memorial Chapel was named for?
I do not, but I would, I'm, as I told you when I was speaking about it, I'm very interested in that institution. So I'll see what I can find out. Earl, do you know? And can you help us?
I don't know.
The reason I ask is that I researched 37 Glendale Street to do a petition for a Boston landmark, and it's now pending. They're getting ready to study it, I hope this year. And the family that lived in that house they were all women, and it was Nancy Everett Barnard and her two daughters, Mary Caroline and Emmeline. And both Mary Caroline and Emmeline, I'm trying to I've written like, how many oral, probably written 300 of these, so I don't have it all in the top of my head, but they were very active in the Barnard Freedmen's Bureau, which went south after the Civil War to educate recently emancipated, formerly enslaved people. So, and then they were also founding members and on boards of, oh gosh, the Girls Industrial School here in Dorchester, the Women's Hospital that I think you just mentioned today on Townsend Street in Roxbury, which is now, of course, the Dimmock Center, and several other things. So, and I could never make the connection between, I'm sure there is one, between that Barnard family and the Barnard Memorial Chapel, and also the Barnard Freedmen's Bureau. They're just, I couldn't connect the dots, and so I didn't write it because I couldn't prove it.
Right.
I'd be very curious to know if that was in fact true. So I have a couple more.
Okay, well, I was just gonna
Nobody
say,
else's hand is up.
definitely something to check into. The chapel was on Warrenton Street.
I'm sorry.
The chapel was on Warrenton Street. I
Right.
don't know if that's it. And right. So again, this is something that maybe we can sort of collaborate in some way, just sort
Yeah,
of.
that would be
so we can-
helpful.
I also want to say thank you, by the way, because as a Christmas gift from my brother, who still lives in Dorchester, 2 years ago, I had the house that he and my sister-in-law live in and that my mom lived in for years on Pierce Avenue, researched, and they learned some very interesting and one tragic thing about their house. So I don't know if you were the one to thank, but anyway, your crew did a great job. And
We have
that was
4 writers, so and we all do a great job. So I'm sure it was wonderful. Do you know, Earl, off the top of your head, do you know who wrote it?
for
Or
Pierce
sorry?
Vicky or Kayla? Everybody's on this call.
You know, they all sound familiar. It could have been me.
Yeah, they do. You're right, they do. And then I'm curious about the child that you're so curious about, Anne. Did you look at Oliver, at Robert Oliver's will?
No.
Because oftentimes, particularly whoever Robert Oliver's parents were, sometimes you can find records of enslaved people. It's just shocking, but it happened.
I know.
Being handed down, being left
Right.
in someone's will, and then you get information that otherwise you just can't find anywhere, especially when it's that far back.
I know it is pretty shocking. I was saying to Earl the other day that when I moved to Framingham, one of the churches here had up in the belfry a section that was set aside for servants, as they were called mystically, and I was suddenly, oh wait, there were enslaved people in this community, and it just suddenly, hit me that this was I was a history major and I studied slavery, but I did not learn a lot about slavery or enslaved people in this section of the country. So I think it's a neglected area that we're still learning about, as you say. And
Well, I will look for that will, and I'll get in touch with Earl to get connected to you.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
that maybe we can figure it out.
Okay. Well, I'd be very interested in what you find. Okay. Is there anyone else? Any other question or comment at this point?
Anything else?
Okay. So I guess I can thank you all for your attention. And I hope that, as I did, that you learned that women were a big part of the story, and we need to keep uncovering. We need to keep uncovering their stories so that they not only won't be forgotten, but we will become more and more aware of the contributions that they did make. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're more than welcome.